If you pull up a satellite view of Australia at night, the pattern is immediately striking. Bright constellations of light trace the southern edge of the continent, a dense, glowing corridor connecting Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide in the southeast. And far to the west, the isolated beacon of Perth shining alone against the darkness. But between these two clusters lies something unusual. A massive black gap stretching across the southern coastline. No sprawling cities, no glowing urban ribbons, just emptiness. This vast shadow belongs to the Great Australian Bight, a dramatic coastline extending more than 1,000 kilometers along the southern edge of the continent. At first glance, it looks like prime real estate. A sweeping oceanfront, endless horizons, and direct access to major shipping routes. In almost any other country, a coastline like this would be lined with ports, resorts, and booming cities. But here, almost nothing. So what happened? Why did one of the longest stretches of coastline in a developed nation remain nearly untouched by large-scale settlement? And how did a place that seems perfect for development become one of the most sparsely populated regions on Earth? The answer begins with a name that sounds almost like a warning label, the Nullarbor, a landscape so unforgiving that even its name translates from Latin as no trees. And as you'll soon see, that name isn't exaggerating. It's more like a survival guide hidden in plain sight. The Nullarbor Plain, forming the entire northern edge of the Great Australian Bight, carries a name that sounds almost poetic, but is brutally literal. Derived from the Latin nullus arbor, meaning no trees, it describes exactly what early explorers saw: a vast, treeless expanse stretching endlessly toward the horizon. And once you understand what the Nullarbor actually is, you start to realize why this coastline never became Australia's next major urban corridor. Geologically, the Nullarbor is extraordinary. It's the largest single exposed slab of limestone bedrock on Earth, roughly 200,000 square kilometers of what was once a shallow seabed, slowly uplifted millions of years ago as tectonic forces reshaped the continent. Today, it appears almost impossibly flat, a landscape so uniform that it can feel surreal, like standing inside a giant natural mirror, reflecting nothing but sky. Driving across it along the air highway is often described as hypnotic, a road that stretches forward in a nearly perfect straight line, disappearing into heat haze while the horizon feels endlessly distant. Under the enormous Australian sky, scale becomes difficult to comprehend. Summer temperatures can push toward 50 degrees Celsius, while winter nights drop below freezing. Early explorer Henry Kingsley famously called it a hideous anomaly, which may sound dramatic, but after a few hours staring at uninterrupted emptiness, you might understand the sentiment. And yet, the Nullarbor's apparent simplicity hides an incredible secret. The surface may look solid, but beneath it lies a labyrinth. Because this massive limestone platform is a karst landscape, slowly dissolved by water over millions of years. Instead of a dense, impenetrable rock layer, the plain is riddled with caves, sinkholes, and underground chambers. More than 4,500 known features forming a hidden world below the desert. In many places, the ground is essentially hollow, like a giant natural sponge carved by time. Some of these underground spaces are astonishingly vast. Abercurry Cave, for example, contains one of the largest single underground chambers in the southern hemisphere. And because the region became arid long ago, these caves act like geological time capsules, preserving fossils and ecosystems in extraordinary detail. Scientists exploring them have uncovered remains of extinct megafauna, such as the marsupial lion, as well as strange, blind creatures that evolved entirely in darkness: spiders, crustaceans, and insects found nowhere else on Earth. It's as if the real Nullarbor exists beneath the one you see. But as fascinating as the underground world is, the defining feature of this region appears when the plain meets the ocean. Because the Nullarbor doesn't gently slope toward beaches or sheltered bays. It simply ends. Here rise the Bunda Cliffs, an almost continuous wall of limestone stretching for more than 200 kilometers along the coast. In some places, the continent drops vertically more than 120 meters straight into the Southern Ocean. There are no river deltas, no natural harbors, no sheltered inlets where early settlers could anchor ships or build ports. Instead of a welcoming shoreline, the land presents something closer to a fortress wall, breathtakingly beautiful, but almost completely impractical for large-scale development. And then there's the ocean itself. The Great Australian Bight faces directly into the Roaring Forties, a powerful band of westerly winds that circle the southern hemisphere with almost no land to slow them down. These winds generate relentless storms and some of the roughest seas on the planet. Waves crash against the cliffs with immense force, creating an environment that is spectacular but unforgiving. Paradoxically, this violence fuels life. The winds drive a process called upwelling, pulling cold, nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean to the surface. This creates one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the world, with roughly 85% of species found here being endemic, meaning they exist nowhere else on Earth. The Bight serves as a crucial nursery for endangered southern right whales, a feeding ground for Australian sea lions, and even habitat for great white sharks. So when you step back, the geography becomes clear. A flat, treeless limestone desert that hides a vast underground world that ends abruptly in the longest line of sea cliffs on Earth, overlooking one of the most powerful oceans on the planet. It's stunning, dramatic, and incredibly hostile to urban development, which begins to explain why this massive stretch of coastline remains so empty today. But despite how harsh it may seem, this land was never truly empty. For tens of thousands of years, far longer than most civilizations in Europe have existed, people not only lived here, they learned how to survive and thrive in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Based on everything we've seen so far, the treeless plain, the towering cliffs, the violent ocean, you might assume that this region remained untouched until modern history finally arrived with advanced technology. But that assumption couldn't be more wrong. Because long before European explorers looked at this coastline and saw an impassable barrier, it was already home. For more than 40,000 years, this land formed part of the traditional country of Aboriginal peoples, most notably the Mirning people. And they didn't just survive here, they developed a deep, sophisticated relationship with one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Where European explorers saw emptiness, the Mirning saw knowledge written into the land itself. Their survival depended on understanding hidden resources, invisible to outsiders. Across the Nullarbor, rare pockets of fresh water, known as Nama's natural rock holes, that collect and preserve rainwater, acted like secret lifelines scattered across the desert. To an untrained eye, the land appeared completely waterless. But to those who knew where to look, it was a map filled with hidden pathways. And perhaps the most powerful evidence of this ancient connection lies deep underground. Inside Kunalda Cave, far beyond the reach of sunlight, archaeologists discovered finger tracings carved into soft limestone walls, markings created more than 20,000 years ago. These weren't random scratches left by desperate travelers seeking shelter. They were deliberate, ceremonial artworks, suggesting ritual significance and a complex cultural identity rooted in this seemingly inhospitable environment. Thousands of years before the pyramids rose in Egypt, people here were already creating art in total darkness, leaving messages that survived across millennia. The Mirning are often called the whale people, and their Dreamtime stories are deeply intertwined with the southern right whales that still migrate each year along the base of the Bunda Cliffs to give birth. It's a reminder that this landscape wasn't empty, it was alive with meaning, stories, and spiritual geography long before outsiders arrived. But when Europeans finally encountered the region, they didn't see a home, they saw a wall. In 1627, Dutch navigator Peter Nuit sailed along the coastline for more than 1,500 kilometers. Searching for rivers, safe harbors, or signs of resources, he found nothing that matched European expectations. The cliffs rose like a fortress, offering no easy landing points, He labeled the area dangerous and unproductive and simply sailed away. For nearly 2 centuries afterward, few others even bothered to return. It wasn't until 1802, during a race between British and French expeditions to chart Australia's coastline, that the region was examined in detail. British explorer Matthew Flinders became the first to navigate the entire length of the Great Australian Bight. His journal reads like a travel diary written by someone slowly losing hope. Day after day, he described the same relentless landscape. Endless vertical cliffs, no rivers, no timber for ship repairs, no obvious fresh water, nothing that a maritime empire needed to establish settlements. To European explorers accustomed to fertile river valleys and sheltered ports, this coastline wasn't just disappointing, it was useless. And yet, curiosity remained. If the coast was inaccessible by sea, perhaps it could be crossed by land. That question led to one of the most dramatic journeys in Australian exploration history. In 1841, explorer Edward John Eyre attempted to find a route connecting Adelaide to the isolated western settlement of Albany. He believed that beyond the harsh coastal fringe lay fertile inland plains and rivers. Instead, he discovered the true scale of the Nullarbor. What followed became a survival epic. Eyre's expedition quickly turned into a slow-motion disaster. Water supplies dwindled, horses were slaughtered for food, the group nearly died multiple times in the endless desert. Survival ultimately depended on Aboriginal knowledge, particularly from his guide Wiley, who located hidden water sources the Europeans had walked past without recognizing. The journey grew even darker when 2 other members murdered Eyre's companion, John Baxter, and fled with supplies, leaving Eyre and Wiley alone, starving and desperate. By sheer luck, they encountered a French whaling ship anchored in a rare sheltered bay. After recovering for weeks, they continued the journey and eventually staggered into Albany, barely alive. Eyre's reports confirmed what explorers had long suspected. This land was not suitable for traditional settlement. It wasn't just difficult, it was hostile. And yet, humans eventually built something here not because they wanted the land itself, but because they needed connection. In the 1870s, Western Australia required communication links with the rest of the continent. The solution was the overland telegraph line, a thin thread of infrastructure stretching across the emptiness. Small repeater stations were built every few hundred kilometers to maintain the signal. Places like Eucla and Baladonia emerged not true towns, but isolated outposts where a handful of people lived quietly, ensuring messages continued to travel across the void. When technology advanced and the telegraph became obsolete, many of these settlements faded away, reclaimed by shifting sands and silence. And that brings us to an intriguing paradox. Other parts of the world, like Phoenix, Arizona, have managed to build large cities in equally harsh desert environments. So why couldn't Australia do the same along the Great Australian Bight? What makes this coastline fundamentally different from other deserts that humans successfully conquered? That answer lies not only in geography, but in economics, distance, and the unique way Australia itself developed. The vast emptiness along Australia's southern coastline isn't just a coincidence, it's the result of geography and history working together like an invisible gatekeeper. We've already seen how the waterless expanse of the Nullarbor Plain and the towering Bunda Cliffs turned away early sailors and nearly destroyed land expeditions like Edward John Eyre's journey across what he described as a living nightmare. But here's the real question. In a world where humans carve highways through mountains, pump water across deserts, and build megacities in places once considered impossible, why does this enormous coastal stretch, more than 1,000 kilometers long, still remain largely empty? The answer isn't ancient mystery or technological limitation. It's economics. Modern technology may allow us to overcome geography, but only if it makes financial sense. And along the Great Australian Bight, almost every geographic feature pushes development in the opposite direction. It starts with the most basic requirement for any city: fresh water. In the 1830s, the Eyre Peninsula, especially the area around modern-day Port Lincoln, was seriously considered as a potential site for South Australia's capital. On paper, it looked perfect. A magnificent natural harbor, strategically positioned for trade, arguably superior to Adelaide's own location. But surveyors quickly discovered a fatal flaw. There were no permanent rivers, not one. The entire region relies on limited rainfall and underground aquifers, natural water reserves, that are already under pressure just supporting existing small communities and dryland agriculture. Some of these aquifers show signs of depletion. Building a major city here would require massive desalination infrastructure, meaning residents would effectively pay premium prices for something most cities take for granted, drinking water. And even if you solve the water problem, you'd immediately encounter the next obstacle: isolation. Cities thrive because they connect networks of people, goods, and ideas. A city along the Great Australian Bight would be astonishingly remote. It lies more than 1,000 kilometers from Adelaide and nearly 2,000 kilometers from Perth. Every piece of infrastructure, every consumer product, every vehicle or appliance would need to be transported across enormous distances at significant cost. Without strong economic output to justify those expenses, large-scale growth simply doesn't happen. And the land itself doesn't provide that economic engine. The Nullabore's limestone foundation offers almost no fertile soil for large-scale agriculture. While the Eyre Peninsula supports farming, especially hardy crops like wheat and barley that tolerate dry conditions, this type of agriculture sustains stable, low-density populations rather than massive urban expansion. It's enough to support towns, not megacities. There are, of course, industries that operate here, but none create the conditions needed for a major population boom. Mining is one of them. The region contains valuable resources such as iron ore, graphite, and zircon. But modern mining relies on automation and specialized teams rather than large permanent populations. Workers often fly in and fly out, living temporarily in purpose-built camps rather than forming diverse urban communities. Then there's the ocean economy. The cold, nutrient-rich waters created by upwelling currents make this coastline one of Australia's most productive fishing zones. Port Lincoln, often called the country's seafood capital, supports a thriving tuna industry worth millions. Yet again, this generates wealth concentrated in specialized industries rather than broad urban growth. And finally, tourism. Visitors travel from across the world to drive the Eyre Highway, stand at the edge of the dramatic Bunda Cliffs, or experience adrenaline-filled shark cage diving. But tourism here thrives precisely because of the emptiness. Roadhouses like Eucla, with a population barely larger than a classroom, exist to support travelers passing through, not settling down permanently. People come to experience isolation, not to erase it. This is the modern reality of the Great Australian Bight. Living here means constantly fighting geography, and that fight is expensive. Power generation costs more. Healthcare access becomes more complex. Infrastructure requires massive investment for relatively small populations. Without a major river, a massive natural harbor, or a high-value industry capable of anchoring a metropolis, there's simply no economic reason for large cities to emerge. And history reinforces this imbalance. Australia's major population centers formed in regions with reliable water, fertile land, and accessible trade routes. Once those urban hubs were established, especially along the fertile southeast coast, growth continued to concentrate there, leaving regions like the Bight permanently on the margins. Today, fewer than 100,000 people live along this entire stretch of coastline, less than 1% of Australia's population, and that number is unlikely to change anytime soon. Australia remains one of the most geographically lopsided countries on Earth. Dense urban life, clustered in the southeast, the isolated glow of Perth in the southwest, and between them, a vast silence shaped by millions of years of geology and reinforced by modern economics. And perhaps that's the true lesson of the Great Australian Bight. Even in an age where humans reshape landscapes at will, some places remain empty, not because we can't build there, but because it simply doesn't make sense to try. If you enjoyed learning about Australia's Great Southern Void, be sure to check out the next video, and thanks for watching. See you next time.